This video is part 2 of writing equations of lines, so it introduces parallel and perpendicular. If you remember from our song, parallel, they're so tame, that's because their slope's the same. Parallel lines are going to have the same slope. As a reminder, parallel lines are two lines that never intersect. So all we are looking at is the slope here. For the first section, it says decide if the following pairs of lines are parallel. So all we are doing is looking at the slope of each line. If you look at number 1, we have y equals 4x minus 1 and y equals 4x plus 2. Remember, your slope is the number in front of x. So for my first equation, I have a slope of 4. And for my second equation, I have a slope of 4. That means that these two lines are parallel. Looking at the second problem, I can't determine the slope unless y is by itself. So you have to use what we learned in Unit 3, and you have to get y by itself. The opposite of negative x is positive x, so I add x over. Remember, you're always doing opposite when you're rearranging. The opposite of multiplying by 2 is to divide everything by 2. 12 divided by 2 is 6. And x over 2 means that I have 1/2 x. Those mean the same thing. For my second equation, I'm going to subtract 5x over. Then I'm going to divide everything by negative 10. So I have negative 3 over 10. And then negative 5 over negative 10 reduces to positive 1/2. On my first equation, I have a slope of 1/2 because it's the number in front of x. On my second equation, I have a slope of 1/2. So for number 2, these two lines are parallel. They have the same slope. I want you to try number 3 on your own, pause the video, and then restart it when you're ready to check. For my first equation, to get y by itself, I'm going to subtract 3x on both sides. Then I'm going to divide everything by 2. When I do that, I have 6 divided by 2, which is 3, and then negative 3 over 2 is going to stay negative 3 over 2x. For the second equation, I subtract 3x on both sides. But then be careful with your signs. You are actually dividing everything by negative 2. When you do that, 6 divided by negative 2 is negative 3. Negative 3 divided by negative 2 is positive 3/2. On my first equation, I have a slope of negative 3 over 2. On my second equation, I have a slope of positive 3 over 2. Even though these are the same number, since one's positive and one's negative, these are not parallel. Let's look at number 4. Number 4 has y equals 7 and y equals negative 3. If you remember from Unit 3, when you just have y, that is the same thing as having a slope of 0. I could rewrite this as 0x plus 7, and it would mean the same thing. I could write this as 0x minus 3, and that would mean the same thing. The x has been canceled out with a 0. From our song, horizontal is our hero, that's because our slope is 0. This just means that I have two horizontal lines. So yes, these are parallel. They have the same slope. Number 5 is the one that's different from all the others, if you remember from Unit 3. On number 5, when you just have x, that means your slope is undefined. Since both of these are just x, they are both undefined. So if you think about this, undefined, undefined, that's the slope of a vertical line. This just means I have two vertical lines. So yes, they are parallel. They have the same slope. So for this first section, all you need to be able to do is determine the slope and then decide if they are the same or not the same. For the second section, we're talking about perpendicular lines. And remember, perpendicular lines are two lines that cross at a right angle. Your lines are going to either be parallel, perpendicular, or neither. So, from our song, perpendicular, here's their story, opposite, reciprocal, that's their glory. Here's what that means. Opposite means one will be positive and one will be negative. Reciprocal means you're going to flip it. So I've given you two examples here. If you have a slope of 2/3, the opposite is going to be negative. The reciprocal is going to be 3/2. So you switch the sign and you flip the fraction. If you had a slope of -1/2, the opposite is to make it positive, and the reciprocal is to flip it. Now remember, 2 is the same thing as 2/1. So anytime you have a whole number, you are going to flip it and make sure you put a 1 underneath. Let's look at some examples. Looking at number 1, my first line has a slope of 5. My second line has a slope of -1/5. Well, 5 is the same thing as 5/1. So the opposite of positive 5 would be a negative. The reciprocal would be 1/5. These are opposite reciprocals, so they are perpendicular. Looking at number 2, I have a slope of 2/3 and I have a slope of 3/2. These are reciprocals. It is 2/3 flipped is 3/2, but they are both positive, so they are not opposite. This means they are not perpendicular. It has to be both opposite and reciprocal. On number 3, whenever you just have x, that means there is an imaginary 1 there. So my slope of the first equation is 1, which is the same thing as 1/1. For my second equation, it's very similar, but there is a -1 in front. So the slope of the second one is -1, which is the same thing as -1/1. If you think about this, these are opposite reciprocal. If I flip 1/1, I'm going to get 1/1. And they are opposite because one's positive and one's negative. That means these are perpendicular. For 4 and 5, you have to get y by itself first and then decide if it's perpendicular or not. So for number 4, first I'm going to subtract 4x. Then I'm going to divide everything by -5. When I do that, 10 divided by -5 is -2, and -4 divided by -5 becomes positive 4/5 x. My slope here is positive 4/5. For the second equation, I'm going to subtract 5x on both sides. Then I'm going to divide everything by -4. When I do that, 2/4 is -1/2, and -5/4 becomes positive 5/4x. My slope here is positive 5/4. These are reciprocal, but they are not opposite, which means on number 4, these are not perpendicular. Go ahead and try number 5, pause the video, and restart it when you're ready to check with me. For my first equation on number 5, I'm going to subtract 7x on both sides. And then I have negative 4y equals 0 minus 7x. You can write the 0 or you can leave it out. It doesn't make a difference. Then I'm going to divide everything by negative 4. So y is 0. Negative 7 divided by negative 4 is positive 7 over 4x. For the second equation, I add 4x on both sides. Then I divide everything by negative 7. Negative 2 over negative 7 becomes positive 2 over 7. And positive 4 divided by negative 7 is just negative 4 over 7x. So for the first equation, I have a slope of 7 over 4. For the second equation, I have a slope of negative 4 over 7. These are opposite, one's positive and one's negative, and they are reciprocal. So these are perpendicular. All right, looking at number 6, I have y equals 3 and y equals negative 1/3. While 3 and negative 1/3 are opposite reciprocal, those are not our slopes. 3 and negative 1/3 here are our y-intercepts. I could rewrite this as 0x plus 3 and 0x minus 1/3, and it would mean the same thing. Our x has been canceled out by a 0 on both of these. So I have a slope of 0 and a slope of 0. These are not perpendicular because we talked about this in the first section. These have the same slope, which means they would actually be parallel. If I were to graph this, horizontal is our hero. That's because the slope is 0. These are two horizontal lines. Now, looking at number 7, I have x equals 2. That means I have a slope of undefined. And then I have y equals negative 6. That means I have a slope of 0. If you remember from our song, undefined, undefined, that's the slope of a vertical line. And horizontal is our hero. That's because the slope is 0. If you have a horizontal line and a vertical line, they will cross at a 90-degree angle. So these are perpendicular. If you think about our opposite reciprocal rule, it also works for this. Because undefined means you have a number over 0. 0 means you have a 0 over a number. So these could be opposite and they could be reciprocal. These are perpendicular.